The evening air carried a slight chill as people made their way into Pemberton Concert Hall. Women in elegant dresses and men in dark suits climbed the marble steps, their voices echoing in hushed excitement. This wasn't just any performance. Tonight, one of the world's most respected classical pianists would perform one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. Inside the grand lobby, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd. Programs rustled as people found their seats in the historic theater. The red velvet chairs had held audiences for over 100 years, and the walls seemed to hold memories of countless performances. But tonight felt different. There was electricity in the air that no one could quite explain. In the third row, an elderly woman settled into her seat with the help of an usher. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly, and despite her age, her eyes sparkled with anticipation. She had traveled 3 hours to be here tonight. This wasn't just another concert for her. The pianist performing was someone she had taught decades ago, back when he was just a nervous boy with remarkably talented hands. Professor Helena sat with her program folded in her lap, remembering those early days. She had seen something special in him from the very first lesson. The way he listened to music, really listened, was different from other students. He didn't just play notes. He understood what the composer was trying to say. She smiled to herself, thinking about how far he had come. Backstage, the pianist stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. Daniel Chen took a deep breath and flexed his fingers. He had performed this piece dozens of times in concert halls around the world. But tonight was different. His heart was beating faster than usual, and it wasn't from nerves about the performance. A knock came at the door. The conductor stepped in, a tall woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Rita had been conducting orchestras for 30 years, but she looked as nervous as Daniel felt. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Daniel turned from the mirror and nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Rita shook her head, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You know this could go terribly wrong. The board members are out there. Critics from every major newspaper. This is being recorded for the national broadcast next month." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "That's exactly why it needs to happen tonight." Rita studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "All right then. 5 minutes to curtain." After she left, Daniel sat down on the small couch in his dressing room. His hands were steady. That was good. He thought about the past 6 months and how everything had led to this moment. How a chance encounter late one night had changed everything. How what he discovered had kept him awake, planning and preparing for tonight. The lights in the concert hall dimmed. The audience quieted instantly. That magical hush that falls over a crowd when something important is about to begin. The orchestra members took their places on stage, the sounds of instruments being tuned, creating a strange symphony of their own. Then Rita walked onto the stage. The audience applauded as she took her place at the conductor's podium. She raised her baton and the musicians positioned themselves ready. The moment stretched out, full of possibility. Daniel walked from the wings into the spotlight. The applause grew louder. He bowed to the audience, then to the orchestra. As he sat at the magnificent Steinway grand piano, he caught a glimpse of Professor Helena in the third row. She was beaming at him, pride written across her face. For a split second, he almost lost his nerve. What he was about to do might upset people. It might cause a scandal, but then he remembered why this mattered. He remembered the music he had heard in an empty hallway, the pure emotion in every note, the way it had moved him to tears. This wasn't about him. This had never been about him. He placed his hands on the keys and nodded to Rita. She raised her baton and the orchestra began. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall. It was a piece that had broken many pianists, known for its technical difficulty and emotional depth. But Daniel's fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease. The first movement unfolded beautifully. The orchestra and piano wove together in complex harmony. People in the audience closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Professor Helena felt tears forming. She had heard this piece hundreds of times, but hearing her former student play it with such maturity and feeling made her heart swell. The technical passages that made other pianists stumble were effortless under Daniel's hands. His body swayed slightly with the music, completely absorbed in the performance. This was what he had trained his whole life to do. From the age of 7, when his mother first brought him to Professor Helena's studio, music had been his entire world. The first movement built to its powerful conclusion. The final chords rang out through the hall and then silence. Usually audiences weren't supposed to clap between movements. But the performance had been so stunning that a few people couldn't help themselves. Scattered applause began, then quickly faded as everyone waited for the second movement to begin. This was the moment. Daniel's heart pounded. Rita looked at him from the podium, her eyebrows slightly raised. One last chance to back out, to just continue with the performance as planned and let everything stay normal and safe. Daniel stood up from the piano bench. The sudden movement caused confused murmurs to ripple through the audience. This wasn't part of the performance. Pianists didn't stand up in the middle of a concerto. He walked to the front of the stage, standing in the bright spotlight. His hands, so steady on the piano keys moments before, trembled slightly now. The audience stared at him in confusion. What was happening? Was he sick? Was something wrong? Daniel cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "I have to confess something to you all tonight." More murmurs from the audience. People shifted in their seats. Professor Helena leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "I've forgotten how to play the rest of this piece," Daniel said. Gasps echoed through the concert hall. Several people in the audience pulled out their phones. Was this really happening? Had one of the world's greatest pianists just admitted to forgetting Rachmaninoff in the middle of a performance? Daniel looked out at the sea of shocked faces. "I was wondering," he continued, his voice steady now despite the chaos his words were causing, "if anyone in the audience might know how to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Perhaps someone could help me finish this performance." The silence that followed was deafening. People looked at each other in disbelief. This had to be some kind of joke. But Daniel's face was completely serious. He stood there waiting, as if he genuinely expected someone from the audience to volunteer to play one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire. From somewhere in the back of the hall, a door creaked open. All eyes turned toward the back of the concert hall. The creaking door seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. People craned their necks, trying to see who was entering. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly a figure emerged from the shadows. He was wearing coveralls, the kind that janitors wear. In one hand he carried a mop and in the other a yellow cleaning bucket. His gray hair was a bit messy, and his shoulders were slightly hunched as if he spent most of his days bent over his work. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe older. A woman in the front row gasped. Several people began whispering to each other. This had to be a joke, some kind of strange performance art. But the man with the mop kept walking down the center aisle, his work boots making soft thuds on the carpeted floor. "Excuse me," the janitor said, his voice rough and uncertain. "I know a bit of Rachmaninoff. Maybe I could help." Someone in the audience laughed nervously. Others looked angry. They had paid a lot of money for these tickets. This was supposed to be a serious classical music performance, not some kind of comedy show. An older gentleman in the 5th row stood up, clearly ready to complain to an usher. But Daniel smiled from the stage. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the piano. "Come on up." "What's your name?" "Vincent," the janitor said quietly, setting down his mop and bucket at the end of a row. "I work here. Clean the building most nights." He climbed the steps to the stage and the spotlight hit him full force. His coveralls had a small stain on the knee. His hands were rough and calloused. These were not the hands of a concert pianist. These were the hands of someone who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans. Professor Helena sat frozen in her seat. Something about this felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. The way the man moved, the slope of his shoulders triggered a memory she couldn't quite reach. Vincent approached the piano like someone approaching something sacred. He stood there for a moment, just looking at the beautiful instrument. The Steinway grand piano gleamed under the stage lights, its black surface reflecting the world around it. His weathered hand reached out and touched the wood gently, almost reverently. "I haven't played on a piano like this in a very long time," Vincent said softly, though the microphones caught his words and carried them through the hall. Daniel stepped aside, giving Vincent room to sit on the bench. The janitor lowered himself slowly, adjusting his position. His hands hovered over the keys but didn't touch them yet. He took a deep breath, and in that moment something changed. His shoulders straightened. His head lifted. It was as if the piano itself was transforming him. Rita, still standing at the conductor's podium, looked at Daniel. He nodded at her. She raised her baton, though her hand shook slightly. The orchestra members exchanged confused glances, but they were professionals. They would play no matter how strange this situation had become. The audience was completely silent now. Phones were out everywhere, recording this bizarre moment. Some people were already texting their friends. You won't believe what's happening at the concert. Others sat with their arms crossed, waiting for this embarrassing situation to end, so the real performance could continue. Vincent's fingers finally touched the keys. He played one note, then another. The sound that came from the piano was clear and pure. He played a simple scale, and even that sounded different somehow. More intentional, more alive. Then he began the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. What happened next made several people in the audience lean forward in their seats. The music that flowed from Vincent's hands was not good. It was extraordinary. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for someone his age, someone who cleaned floors for a living. The notes weren't just technically perfect. They were full of emotion, full of life and pain and joy all mixed together. The orchestra came in right on cue, and suddenly the hall was filled with the most beautiful music. Vincent's playing had a quality that was different from Daniel's perfect technique. There was something raw about it, something that came from deep inside. Every note seemed to carry a story. In the third row, Professor Helena's hands flew to her mouth. Tears began streaming down her face. She knew this playing. She knew the way those hands moved, the slight tilt of the head when concentrating on a difficult passage. Even after all these years, even dressed in janitor's coveralls, she recognized him. Roberto, she whispered to herself. Oh my God, Roberto. The second movement of Rachmaninoff's third concerto is not as technically demanding as the other movements, but it requires something harder to teach. It requires the pianist to bare their soul. The music is heartbreaking and beautiful, full of longing and sadness and hope all at once. Vincent played it like someone who understood that pain intimately. His eyes were closed now and tears rolled down his weathered cheeks. But his hands never faltered. They moved with absolute certainty, finding every note, every chord, every delicate passage with the skill of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. People in the audience started to realize something incredible was happening. The angry expressions faded. The phones that had been ready to capture a disaster were now recording something magical instead. A few people started crying, moved by the sheer emotion in the music. The piece built and built, the orchestra swelling behind Vincent's piano. Rita conducted with her eyes also filling with tears. She had worked with hundreds of pianists in her career, but she had never heard Rachmaninoff played quite like this. There was wisdom in every note, the kind of wisdom that only comes from experiencing real loss and real pain. As the movement reached its most tender moment, Vincent's playing became almost impossibly soft. The audience held its breath. You could have heard a pin drop in that enormous hall. And then, just as the music began to build toward its conclusion, something unexpected happened. From the wings of the stage hands began wheeling out a second piano. Another Steinway grand, identical to the first. The audience murmured in confusion again. What was going on? Why did they need two pianos? Daniel walked to the second piano and sat down. He waited for his moment in the score, and then his hands came down on the keys. But he wasn't playing the same part as Vincent. He was playing a harmony line, a second part that wove in and around the melody. This wasn't the original Rachmaninoff. This was an arrangement, a duet version that had been created specifically for two pianos, and it was absolutely breathtaking. The two pianists played together as if they had been doing it for years. Vincent's weathered hands and Daniel's younger, stronger hands created a conversation in music. They answered each other, challenged each other, supported each other. The orchestra surrounded them both with waves of sound. Professor Helena was sobbing openly now. Other people in the audience were crying too, though many of them didn't fully understand why. There was just something about this music, about this moment that touched something deep inside. The man next to Professor Helena leaned over. Are you all right? He asked with concern. She nodded, unable to speak. How could she explain? How could she tell this stranger that the janitor on stage was one of the greatest pianists of his generation, that he had disappeared 15 years ago? and everyone thought he had left the country or worse, that she had mourned him like a son. And now here he was playing with more feeling and beauty than she had ever heard from him before. The two pianos danced together, building toward the conclusion of the second movement. The music swelled to fill every corner of the enormous hall, and then, with one final delicate chord, it ended. The silence that followed lasted for 3 full seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then the concert hall erupted. The applause started small. Just a few people clapping in shock and amazement. But within seconds it grew into a roar. The entire audience rose to their feet as if pulled by invisible strings. People were clapping, cheering, some still crying. The sound was deafening. Vincent sat at the piano, his hands still resting on the keys. He looked dazed, as if waking from a dream. Daniel stood beside his own piano, clapping too, a wide smile on his face. Rita lowered her conductor's baton and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The standing ovation went on and on. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. People didn't want to stop. They had just witnessed something that couldn't be explained, something that shouldn't have been possible. A janitor had just played one of the most difficult pieces in classical music, with a depth of emotion that professional pianists spend lifetimes trying to achieve. Vincent slowly stood up from the piano bench. He looked out at the sea of faces, all staring at him, all applauding for him. He seemed overwhelmed, almost frightened by the attention. His hand went to his chest, and for a moment Daniel worried he might collapse. But then Vincent straightened his shoulders again. He turned to the orchestra and bowed to them. He bowed to Rita, and then he bowed to Daniel. The younger pianist walked over and embraced him. The audience cheered even louder. Daniel held up his hand, asking for quiet. It took almost a minute for the applause to die down enough for him to speak. People settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room was electric. Everyone knew they were part of something special, something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. "Thank you," Daniel said into the microphone. His voice was thick with emotion. "I need to tell you all something. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't spontaneous. Everything you just witnessed was planned." Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. "Planned? How could this have been planned?" 6 months ago, Daniel continued, I was here late one night practicing for a performance. It was past midnight. The building was supposed to be empty except for security and the night cleaning crew. But as I was leaving, I heard something. Music. Someone was playing the piano in one of the practice rooms. Vincent stood beside him, looking down at his worn boots. His hands were clasped in front of him, and he seemed to be trying to make himself smaller. "I followed the sound," Daniel said, "and I found this man, sitting at an old upright piano in a practice room barely bigger than a closet. He was playing Chopin, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I stood in the hallway listening for 20 minutes before he noticed me. When he finally looked up and saw me standing there, he stopped immediately. He apologized for making noise. Can you imagine? He apologized for creating that kind of beauty. He told me he was just the janitor, that he'd play more quietly, that he'd stop if it bothered me." Daniel paused, looking at Vincent with obvious affection and respect. "I asked him to keep playing. I asked him where he learned. He wouldn't tell me at first. He just kept saying it didn't matter, that it was a long time ago, that he was nobody important. But I kept coming back, night after night. I would practice, and then I would find him, and I would listen. Sometimes we would play together. And slowly, over weeks and months, he started to tell me his story. In the third row, Professor Helena was gripping the armrests of her seat so tightly her knuckles were white. She already knew the story. She had lived part of it. This man, Daniel said, turning to face Vincent fully, is not actually a janitor. I mean, yes, he has been working as a janitor here for the past 15 years. But that's not who he is. His real name is Roberto Valdez. And 30 years ago, he was one of the most celebrated concert pianists in the world. The gasp that went through the audience was like a wave. Several people pulled out their phones immediately, searching the name. Those old enough to remember classical music from the 90s started whispering excitedly to their companions. Roberto Valdez, of course. How had they not recognized him? Some of you may remember, Daniel continued. Roberto Valdez performed in every major concert hall in the world. He recorded 12 albums. He won the Tchaikovsky competition when he was just 23 years old. Critics called him the voice of a generation. He was famous, successful, at the absolute peak of his career. Vincent, or rather Roberto, stood with tears running down his face now. He didn't try to hide them or wipe them away. He just let them fall. And then, 20 years ago, his wife died, Daniel said quietly. The hall was so silent you could hear people breathing. She had been sick for a long time. Cancer. Roberto stopped performing to take care of her. He was with her every day until the end. And when she passed away, something in him broke. Daniel's own voice cracked with emotion. He couldn't play anymore. Not professionally. Every time he sat at a piano, all he could feel was the loss. The music that had once brought him so much joy now only reminded him of what he'd lost. So he stopped. He disappeared from the classical music world. People thought he had moved back to Argentina where he was born. Some people thought he had died. But really he was here, working at night in the shadows, cleaning the same concert halls where he had once performed. Someone in the audience was crying audibly now. The story was almost too sad to bear. This brilliant man, reduced to mopping floors in the building where he should have been celebrated. But he never really stopped playing, Daniel said. He couldn't. Music was too much a part of him. So late at night, when everyone was gone, he would find a piano, any piano, and he would play. Not for audiences, not for money or fame, just for himself. Just to keep that part of himself alive. Roberto finally spoke, his rough voice barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught it. Music was the only thing that helped, he said. In the quiet, in the dark, I could play for her. I could remember the good times. It was my way of holding on to what we had. Professor Helena couldn't stay in her seat any longer. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. Roberto, she called out. Her voice broke on his name. Roberto's head snapped up. He stared out into the audience, searching for the source of the voice. When he saw Professor Helena, his face transformed. All the years, all the pain, all the hiding seemed to fall away. Professor, he said, his voice full of wonder and disbelief. You're here. Of course I'm here, she said, making her way toward the aisle. An usher tried to help her, but she waved him off. She walked down to the stage, her elderly legs moving as fast as they could. Do you think I would miss one of my students performing? She climbed the steps to the stage, and Roberto met her halfway. They embraced like family members who hadn't seen each other in decades. Because that's essentially what they were. I thought I'd lost you, Professor Helena said. When you disappeared, I thought I'd never see you again. I'm sorry, Roberto said. I'm so sorry. I couldn't face anyone. I couldn't face the music world. I couldn't face you. I had failed. Professor Helena pulled back and looked him in the eyes. Failed? You just played Rachmaninoff with more feeling than I've heard in 50 years of attending concerts. That's not failure, Roberto. That's triumph. The audience watched this reunion with rapt attention. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was real life, real emotion unfolding before them. Daniel cleared his throat. For the last 3 months, he said, Roberto has been teaching me. Really teaching me. Not just technique, but how to find the soul in the music, how to play with honesty. And together we created this arrangement. 2 pianos, 1 conversation. And we planned tonight, this performance, because I wanted the world to remember Roberto Valdez, and I wanted Roberto to remember who he really is. Roberto turned to face the audience again. This time he didn't look scared or overwhelmed. He looked like someone who had just woken up after a very long sleep. The applause started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just appreciation for beautiful music. It was recognition. It was welcome. It was an entire audience telling Roberto that they saw him, that they valued him, that he belonged on that stage. Roberto stood there taking it in, and something in his posture changed. The hunched shoulders of the janitor were gone completely. He stood tall, the way he must have stood 30 years ago when he first conquered the world's great concert stages. Professor Helena remained beside him, her hand on his arm, as if afraid he might disappear again if she let go. Daniel stepped forward once more. We're not finished yet, he announced. Roberto and I have one more piece to play for you tonight. The 3rd movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. And this time, we're going to play it the way it was meant to be played. Together. The audience erupted in cheers. Whatever schedule they had for the rest of the evening no longer mattered. Nobody was leaving this concert hall. They would stay all night if they had to. Rita raised her baton again, a huge smile on her face. The orchestra members shifted in their seats, readying their instruments. Some of them were wiping their own eyes. They had just been part of something that would define their careers. Roberto walked back to his piano, but this time he didn't shuffle or hesitate. He moved with confidence. Daniel took his place at the second piano. The two men looked at each other across the stage, and something passed between them. An understanding. A friendship that had been forged in those late-night practice sessions. In the quiet hours when Roberto had finally begun to heal. The third movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 is famous for being one of the most physically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. It requires speed, power, precision, and endurance. Most pianists are exhausted by the end of it. But as the music began, both Roberto and Daniel seemed energized rather than tired. Their fingers flew across the keys. The two pianos created a wall of sound that filled every corner of the massive hall. The orchestra surged behind them, drums pounding, strings soaring. It was music that demanded everything from everyone playing it, and Roberto gave everything he had. His hands moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. All those years of hiding, of cleaning floors, of playing only in the darkness, seemed to have preserved something in him. Or perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps all that grief and loss and loneliness had been transformed into something powerful through the music. People in the audience were filming on their phones, but many had given up trying to capture it. They just wanted to experience it, to be fully present for this moment. A woman in the 10th row held her teenage daughter's hand, squeezing it tight. The daughter had been studying piano for 8 years and had been ready to quit. But watching Roberto's transformation, watching the pure joy on his face as he played, she felt something rekindling inside her. The technical passages that made other pianists stumble were executed flawlessly by both men, but it was more than just technical skill. There was a conversation happening between the two pianos. Daniel's youth and strength combined with Roberto's wisdom and experience created something neither could have achieved alone. Professor Helena had returned to her seat, but she sat on the edge of it, unable to relax. She watched Roberto's face as he played. She had taught him when he was just 15 years old, a shy boy from Buenos Aires who barely spoke English but could make a piano sing in any language. She had known then that he was special. She had known he would be great, but she had also seen his sensitive heart, the way he felt everything so deeply. When his wife had gotten sick, Professor Helena had understood why he stopped performing. And when he disappeared after her death, she had understood that too, even though it broke her heart. Some people needed to grieve alone. Some people needed to hide from the world while they healed. She had just never imagined he was hiding here, in the same city, in the very building where she had occasionally attended concerts. How many times had she walked past him without knowing? How many times had he cleaned the lobby after she had left, the two of them missing each other by minutes? The music built and built, reaching toward the explosive finale. Both pianists were pouring sweat now, their hands moving faster than seemed humanly possible. The orchestra was at full volume, every instrument contributing to the massive sound. Rita conducted with her entire body, lost in the music, and then came the final measures. The last racing passages up and down the keyboard, the orchestra's final powerful chords. And then, with a thunderous conclusion that shook the building, it was done. The silence lasted only a fraction of a second before the audience exploded. This time, people weren't just clapping. They were shouting, whistling, cheering. The standing ovation was immediate and universal. Every single person in that concert hall was on their feet. Roberto stood up from the piano, breathing hard. He looked stunned, overwhelmed, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Daniel came over and grabbed his hand, raising both their arms in the air like victorious athletes. The crowd roared even louder. They bowed together once, twice, 3 times. The applause didn't stop. Rita and the orchestra stood and applauded too, which was unusual. Musicians didn't typically applaud other musicians during a performance. But this wasn't a typical performance. Professor Helena was crying again, but these were different tears. These were tears of joy, of relief, of gratitude. Her student had come back. Not just physically, but spiritually. She could see it in his eyes. Roberto had returned to himself. After what must have been 10 minutes of continuous applause, Daniel finally held up his hand for quiet. It took a long time for the audience to settle down. People didn't want this night to end. They wanted to hold on to this feeling forever. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Thank you all so much. I want to say something about tonight, about what this means. He paused, looking at Roberto, who stood beside him, still catching his breath. We live in a world that often judges people by their job titles, by their status, by their appearance. Tonight, many of you saw a janitor walk onto this stage. Some of you were angry. Some of you thought it was a joke. Some of you were ready to demand your money back. A few nervous laughs came from the audience. It was true. Many people had felt exactly that way. But greatness doesn't always look the way we expect it to look, Daniel continued. Talent doesn't always wear a tuxedo. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones we walk past every day without noticing. The person who cleans your office. The person who serves your coffee. The person who holds the door open for you. He put his hand on Roberto's shoulder. This man has been here for 15 years. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people have passed him in the hallways. They've seen him emptying trash cans and mopping floors, but they didn't really see him. They didn't know that the hands pushing that mop were the same hands that once played for presidents and kings. That the man in coveralls was someone who had brought tears to audiences around the world. Roberto nodded slowly, his own tears flowing freely now. I didn't plan this performance to embarrass anyone, Daniel said. I planned it to remind all of us, myself included, to really see people, to not make assumptions, to remember that everyone has a story, everyone has value, and you never know what kind of beauty someone might be carrying inside them. The audience sat in silence, absorbing these words. Many people felt ashamed of their initial reactions. Many were thinking about people in their own lives they had overlooked or dismissed. But more than that, Daniel said, his voice growing stronger. I planned this performance for Roberto himself, because he needed to remember who he is. He needed to know that the music world didn't forget him, that his gift still matters, that it's not too late. He turned to face Roberto directly. It's not too late, he repeated. Roberto looked at Daniel with eyes full of emotion. For a long moment he couldn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet but steady. For 15 years I believed my life as a musician was over. I thought that part of me had died along with my wife. But this young man, he gestured to Daniel, he showed me something important. He showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that healing is possible, that music isn't just something we do, it's something we are. The audience listened, completely silent. You could feel the weight of every word. My wife loved music, Roberto continued, his voice growing stronger. She loved hearing me play. Even at the end, when she was so sick, she would ask me to play for her. And I did. But after she was gone, sitting at a piano felt like sitting at her grave. Every note reminded me of what I had lost. So I ran away, I hid. I convinced myself that I was nobody. Just a man with a mop and a bucket. It felt safer that way. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But music doesn't let you go so easily. It finds you in the quiet moments. It calls to you. So I would play late at night when no one was around. I told myself it didn't matter, that nobody would ever hear, that I was just an old man playing for ghosts. Professor Helena was nodding from her seat, tears streaming down her face. She understood. She had always understood. And then one night someone did hear, Roberto said, looking at Daniel with deep affection. This brilliant young pianist who could have ignored me, who could have asked me to be quiet and leave him alone. Instead, he listened. He sat in the hallway and listened. And then he came back the next night. And the next, and slowly he reminded me that music is meant to be shared, that hiding my gift wasn't honoring my wife's memory, it was burying it. Daniel stepped closer to Roberto, standing shoulder to shoulder with him. Roberto has been teaching me for 3 months now, he said, and I've learned more from him in that time than I learned in years at the conservatory. Not just about playing the piano, about what music really means, about courage, about coming back from loss, about being human. The two men stood together on that stage, representing 2 different generations but united by the same love of music. The audience watched, many of them thinking about their own lives, their own losses, their own hidden talents that they had given up on. So what happens now? Someone called out from the audience. It was a fair question. This had been an incredible night, but what came next? Roberto took a breath. I've received some phone calls already, he said with a small smile. People in this audience have been texting and posting videos online. I'm told there are offers, concert halls wanting me to perform, recording companies wanting me to make albums. It's all very overwhelming. The audience murmured excitedly. Of course there were offers. Everyone wanted a piece of this story. The comeback. The phoenix rising from the ashes. It was the kind of story that would be on every news channel by morning. But I'm not interested in becoming famous again, Roberto said firmly. I don't need sold-out concert halls or magazine covers. I've had that life. It was wonderful, but it's not what I want anymore. Some people in the audience looked confused. If he didn't want to return to performing, then why had he agreed to tonight? What I want, Roberto continued, is to give back. I want to teach. Not at some prestigious conservatory where only rich families can afford the tuition. I want to teach kids who might never get a chance otherwise. Kids who have talent but no opportunities. Kids who might be cleaning buildings themselves one day, carrying music inside them that no one ever hears. Daniel pulled out an envelope from his jacket pocket. Roberto and I have been working on something, he said. With the help of some generous donors who have been moved by Roberto's story, we're starting a foundation. We're calling it the Second Chance Music Foundation. He opened the envelope and pulled out some papers. We've secured funding to offer free piano lessons and instruments to children from low-income families. We've rented space in this building, and Roberto has agreed to be the lead instructor. The audience erupted in applause again. This was better than a comeback tour. This was something that would change lives. But that's not all, Daniel said, holding up his hand. The foundation will also provide opportunities for adults who gave up on music. People who had to quit lessons because of financial hardship. People who dreamed of playing but never had the chance. People who stopped playing because life got in the way. It's never too late to start. It's never too late to come back. Professor Helena stood up again, applauding so hard her hands hurt. This was exactly right. This was exactly what Roberto should do. He had always been a natural teacher, patient and encouraging, and now he would help others find their voice the way music had helped him find his way back. The video of that night spread across the internet like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed millions of times. News outlets picked up the story. People were sharing it with comments like, "This made me cry," and "Never judge a book by its cover," and "I'm going back to piano lessons." But the real impact happened quietly, in the weeks and months that followed. The Second Chance Music Foundation received thousands of applications. Parents who couldn't afford music lessons for their talented children. Adults who had always dreamed of learning but thought they were too old. People who had given up music years ago and wanted to try again. Roberto showed up every day, no longer in coveralls but in comfortable teaching clothes. He worked with students of all ages, from 6-year-olds learning their first scales to 60-year-olds rediscovering a love they thought they'd lost. His patience was infinite. His encouragement was genuine, and his story inspired every person who walked through the door. One afternoon, 3 months after the concert, a young girl came in for her first lesson. She was 9 years old, shy and nervous. Her mother worked 2 jobs and had saved for months to buy a cheap keyboard, but she couldn't afford lessons. When she heard about the foundation, she cried with relief. Roberto sat with the girl at the piano. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophie," she said quietly. "Sophie, have you ever touched a piano before?" She shook her head. Roberto smiled. "Then today is a very special day. Today you begin a journey, and I promise you, if you stick with it, if you practice and work hard, music will be your friend for life. It will be there when you're happy. It will be there when you're sad. It will never leave you." He placed her small hands on the keys and showed her how to play her first note. The sound filled the room, clear and pure. Sophie's eyes went wide with wonder. "Beautiful," Roberto said. "You're going to be wonderful." Daniel often stopped by the foundation after his own performances. He would play duets with students, offer encouragement, and help Roberto with the administrative work. The two had formed a deep friendship, more like father and son than teacher and student. One evening, after all the students had gone home, they sat together at the 2 grand pianos that now occupied the main teaching room. Donors had provided them, moved by the story of the concert. "Do you have any regrets?" Daniel asked. "About not taking those performance offers? You could be touring the world right now." Roberto thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I've toured the world. I've played for thousands of people in fancy concert halls. It was amazing. But this," he gestured around the room at the walls covered with pictures of students, at the schedule board filled with lesson times. This feels like what I was meant to do all along. Every kid who learns to play, every adult who rediscovers their passion, that's my legacy now. That matters more than any recording or review ever could. Daniel nodded, understanding completely. Your wife would be proud. Roberto smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Yes, he said softly. I think she would be. 6 months after the concert, Professor Helena visited the foundation. She was in her 80s now and didn't get around as easily as she used to, but she had to see what Roberto had built. She walked through the rooms, listening to the sound of pianos being played at different skill levels. Chopsticks in one room, Mozart in another, jazz chords in a third. It was chaotic and beautiful all at once. Roberto saw her and immediately came over, offering his arm for support. Professor, he said warmly. Welcome to our little chaos, she laughed. It's not chaos. It's life. It's music. It's perfect. They stood together watching a teenager work through a difficult passage, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. The boy made a mistake and started over, determined to get it right. You know, Professor Helena said, I've taught hundreds of students in my life, and I'm proud of all of them. But I think I'm most proud of this, of what you're doing here. You took your pain and turned it into something beautiful. That's what great artists do. Roberto put his arm around her shoulders. I learned from the best, he said. That night, long after everyone had left, Roberto sat alone at one of the pianos. He played softly, a piece his wife had loved. But this time, the sadness wasn't overwhelming. This time, the music felt like gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had together. Gratitude for the music that had saved him. Gratitude for the second chance he had been given. The building was quiet except for the sound of the piano. But it wasn't the lonely quiet of those late nights when he cleaned floors and played in the dark. It was a peaceful quiet, the quiet of a life that had found its purpose again. Roberto played the final notes and let them ring out in the empty room. Tomorrow, the space would be filled with students again, with laughter and mistakes and small victories, with the sound of people discovering what they were capable of. He smiled to himself, closed the piano lid gently, and headed home. Not to an empty apartment, but to a life full of meaning. The janitor with the extraordinary gift had found his way back to the light. And in doing so, he had lit the way for countless others.